The last thing Jonah Slate believed with his whole chest in his old life was that the vending machine on the third floor owed him a bag of pretzels. He'd fed it exactly $4 in exact sun-faded quarters, the kind that live in the bottom of a car's cup holder for geological eras, and watched the little metal coil spin the bag forward and watched the bag stop hung up on the lip of the coil the way every vending machine on Earth has been hanging up bags of pretzels since the dawn of vending machines, as if it were a design feature and not a design failure. He had rocked the machine, gently at first, the way you'd nudge a stubborn drawer, then less gently. Then, and this was the part his ex-girlfriend would have called the whole entire problem with you. Jonah. He had put his whole body into it, both hands on the case, driven by $4 of pure unshakable conviction that the universe, this one time, after every other time, owed him the payout he'd already paid for. The universe settled the account by dropping 400 pounds of steel and glass directly on top of him. He did not get the pretzels. He did, in the last half-second of a life he'd spent losing small amounts of money to machines that hated him, have time for exactly one clear thought, delivered in the flat, disgusted tone of a man who has just watched his own logic collapse in real time. Of course. Of course, it was the machine. It was always going to be the machine. He woke up on his back in wet grass, under a sky the wrong color, with a voice in his skull that sounded exactly like the chime of a slot machine paying out on a losing spin. Bright, cheerful, and somehow deeply insincere. System, welcome contestant. A prize has been selected for you. Please insert currency to continue. I don't have any currency, Jonah said out loud to the sky, in a voice that came out several years younger than the one he remembered owning, and immediately understood two things in quick succession. The first was that he was not dead in the ordinary, permanent sense of the word, which was, frankly, more disorienting than being dead would have been. The second was that when he looked down at his own hands, smaller, unscarred, missing the crooked pinky he'd broken falling off a bar stool in 2019, something in his vision shifted, the way a slot reel shifts one notch before it locks, and a translucent gold panel unfolded in the air in front of his face like the front of a machine he had spent an entire previous existence feeding coins into. It had a coin slot. It had a lever. It had 4 spinning reels, currently blank, currently waiting. It had, in small stenciled letters across the top, the words "The Machine" in the exact typeface of every out-of-order snack dispenser that had ever eaten his lunch money. No, Jonah said, sitting up in grass that came up to his shoulders in a world he did not recognize, with a body he'd apparently been issued off the rack that morning. No, come on. System. The machine. Core function active. Insert 1. Monster core. To receive 1 randomized prize. Rarity. Tiers. Junk. Common. Uncommon. Rare. Epic. Mythic. Jackpot. Current inventory. 0 cores. Please acquire a core to begin play. There is a particular kind of laugh a man laughs when the universe has just confirmed with documentation that it hates him specifically and has hated him consistently across at least 2 separate lifetimes. Jonah laughed that laugh alone in tall grass for close to a minute until something in the tree line 40 yards off made a sound like a dinner bell being rung by something with entirely too many teeth. And he discovered that his new body, whatever else it lacked, still came standard with a fully functional fight-or-flight response. He chose flight. It went badly. It went badly specifically because the grass hit a drainage ditch that his new, unfamiliar legs had no muscle memory for, and he went down hard, and the thing making the dinner bell noise cleared the tree line at a dead run, and Jonah Slate 31 years old, in a body that couldn't have been older than 19, 6 minutes into a second life, flat on his back in a ditch, had exactly enough time to think this is a genuinely insulting way to die twice before something the approximate size and temperament of an enraged boar, but wrong in the jaw in a way his eyes kept sliding off, closed the last 10 feet between them. It also, inconveniently for the thing, tripped on the same ditch. The impact staggered it sideways into a half-collapse close enough that Jonah, running purely on the specific reptilian instinct of a man who had once wrestled a broken vending machine to a draw out of sheer spite, got both hands on something at its throat that turned out, once his fingers stopped shaking long enough to identify it, to be a fist-sized, faintly luminous stone lodged just beneath its jaw. He pulled. It came free with a sound he would spend a long time trying not to remember, and the creature, deprived of whatever the stone had been doing for it, went still in a way that was very clearly not sleeping. The gold panel chimed, cheerfully, insincerely. System, 1 monster core acquired. Boarhound, juvenile. Insert core to play? I am not, Jonah said, kneeling in a ditch with a dead monster's throat stone in his shaking hand and the after echo of dinner bell still ringing in his ears. Gambling with my own survival 40 seconds after nearly dying twice. He fed the core into the slot anyway. Of course he did. It had never, in either life, taken him longer than 40 seconds to find the coin slot. The reel spun, 3 of them lighting gold, cycling through symbols too fast to read, a sound very precisely calibrated to the exact pitch of every slot machine that had ever taken his rent money, and stopped, one at a time, with the specific, unhurried cruelty of a machine that knew exactly how long a human heart could tolerate suspense before it started actually hoping. System result. Junk tier. Prize awarded. Perfect potato peeling. Passive. You will never again leave the eye in a potato. Congratulations. There was a silence in the clearing that Jonah felt personally obligated to fill. I nearly died, he said to the panel, to the sky, to whatever cosmic entity ran this particular machine, and you gave me a vegetable skill. System, the house, thanks you for playing. That, more than the boarhound, more than the ditch, more than the sheer physical fact of being 19 again in a body he hadn't earned, was the sentence that told Jonah Slade exactly what kind of second life he'd been issued. The house thanks you for playing. Not the system, not fate, not the gods, not any of the grand cosmic dressing he half remembered from the handful of trashy paperbacks he'd read about people getting reincarnated into other worlds. The house. The specific load-bearing phrase of every casino floor he'd ever bled money onto, delivered here with the exact same warm, hollow sincerity as if some entity on the other end of his new existence had looked at the raw material of a man who died fighting a vending machine and thought, yes, him. Let's give him the machine again, but bigger, and see what he does with a whole world to lose it in. He sat in the ditch for a long time, throatstone cooling in one fist, and did the only thing his old life had ever actually trained him to do competently, which was calculate odds. By the time he found the road, a rutted dirt track that eventually widened into something with actual wheel marks running along the edge of a tree line so dense and so wrong-colored that even his untrained eye read it as "do not enter," Jonah had fed 2 more cores into the machine, both scavenged off things he'd rather not think too hard about killing, and pulled 2 more junk-tier results. Whistle passing wind on command, which he immediately banned himself from ever using in front of another living person, and instant coin sorting, which was, if he was honest, the single most on-brand piece of system cruelty he could imagine, a skill for sorting money he no longer had a use for. He'd also learned, through the unglamorous method of nearly getting his arm taken off by something with too many legs, that the forest, every local he'd have occasion to ask would call it the Blightwood, always with the specific flat dread of people naming a debt they'd stopped hoping to collect on, produced monster cores at a rate that made the rest of the countryside look, by comparison, almost tame. That was, Jonah understood with the specific clarity of a man recognizing a table he'd sat at before, the whole game. High volatility, high variance. Everyone else on this road was staying well clear of the Blightwood's edge, farming the safe, boring, low-stakes monsters further out where the drops from actual combat, coin, hide, the ordinary currency of a frontier economy, were survivable and predictable. The cores that fed his machine were sitting in the one stretch of land nobody sane wanted to work. System, insert core to play. Later, Jonah told it, and kept walking, and did not examine too closely the fact that some small traitorous part of his chest had already started doing the math on how many cores it would take at this rarity table before something worth having came up. He made himself stop walking long enough to actually finish that thought because he recognized, with the specific unpleasant clarity of a man who had made this exact mistake before, that the alternative was letting the thought finish itself for him somewhere down the road, in worse company, with less daylight left to think it through. He had died once already for want of a set of rules he'd never once bothered to write down. He was not going to make that particular mistake twice in one lifetime, even if the lifetime in question technically belonged to someone else's borrowed 19-year-old body. So, he set the rules out loud, alone on a dirt road with a dead thing's throat stone cooling in his pocket, the way a man sets rules for himself when there's no one else around yet to hold him to them. Rule 1. He would never feed a core he couldn't afford to lose completely, which on a day like today meant, functionally, every core he had, and he filed that problem away to solve properly once he'd actually built something worth protecting. Rule 2. He would never chase a bad pull with a worse one out of spite, the specific self-destructive arithmetic that had put 400 pounds of vending machine on top of him in his first life, because the house, whatever and whoever the house actually was, had made it very clear in one sentence that it thanked him for playing regardless of the outcome, which meant it did not care, even slightly, whether he won or lost, only whether he kept sitting down. And Rule 3, the one that took him the longest to actually put words to, walking the last stretch of road into a town he did not yet know, was called Hollow Stake. He would never, under any circumstances he could currently imagine, let anyone else pay the price of a pull he had chosen to make. Whatever he lost at this table, he intended to make sure it stayed his loss, and his alone, for as long as he had any say in the matter. He would break that third rule inside of 2 months, more thoroughly than he could have imagined on that road, and it would very nearly cost him everything the first 2 rules had been built to protect. But he did not know that yet, and a man is allowed, for one evening at least, the small mercy of not knowing what's coming. The settlement at the Blightwood's edge, 3 buildings and a well, held together mostly by stubbornness, called Hollow Stake by the handful of people willing to admit they lived there, had exactly one working theory about the teenager who wandered in out of the tree line at dusk with a monster's throat stone in each hand and no visible weapon, and the theory was, loudly and unanimously, dead by morning. "You want to sell those?" said the woman behind the taproom's plank counter, a broad, weathered figure introduced to him within the hour as Ness, sole proprietor of the only building in Hollow Stake with a working roof. "You take them to the assay post 2 towns over, where they've got a licensed appraiser and a scale that isn't a lie. Nobody out here buys cores off strangers walking out of the Blightwood alone. Bad luck. Worse business." "I'm not selling," Jonah said, setting both stones on the bar with the specific, deliberate care of a man laying down cards he knew were terrible and intended to bluff anyway. "I'm using them." "I've got a—" He searched briefly for a word this world would recognize and found, with a certain grim inevitability, that the one his own head kept supplying was the only accurate one. "A machine. It eats cores. Gives me skills back. Randomly." Ness looked at him for a long moment with the specific patience of a barkeep who has heard every possible variation of a lie in her professional life and was doing him the courtesy of deciding slowly whether this was a new one. "You've got a blessing," she said finally, using a word Jonah's translated understanding of the language filed under system, common, that just gives things out at random. At random, Jonah agreed. Weighted, I think, toward garbage. I've pulled 3 so far. 1 lets me peel a potato without wasting any of it. 1 lets me sort coins by value without looking. 1 I am never, under any circumstances, demonstrating in this tap room. Something in Ness's face did a complicated thing. Professional skepticism colliding, visibly, with the specific dry amusement of a woman who has run a bar on a dangerous frontier for long enough to have heard genuinely stranger things turn out true, and you keep feeding it. Knowing that, Jonah confirmed. Why? He thought about the honest answer, because 40 seconds after I nearly died twice, some part of me was already calculating whether the next pull would be the good one, and that part of me has never once in either of my lives lost an argument with the rest of me, and gave her instead the version that was also true, just smaller. Because everyone else on this road is farming the safe monsters 2 miles that way, Jonah said, nodding vaguely west, away from the tree line. For coin and hide they can actually count on. And nobody's touching the Blightwood, because the Blightwood doesn't give you anything you can count on. It gives you a pull on a machine with a payout table nobody's ever seen the bottom of. He set both throat stones a half-inch closer to himself, an unconscious proprietary gesture he caught himself making and didn't correct. I have spent my entire life in one form or another being the only person at the table willing to sit down at the game nobody else wants to play. I'm not about to stop now that dying didn't even make me quit. Ness studied him for another long moment. Teenager's face, old man's cadence, 2 monster cores on her bar, and a look in his eye she'd apparently seen before on other men in other contexts, usually right before they lost everything they owned to a dice game. And then, unexpectedly, laughed, short and rough. "God's help this town," she said. "We've gone and gotten ourselves a professional degenerate." She reached under the bar and sat down with the specific ceremony of a woman marking an occasion, a chipped mug of something that smelled aggressively of turpentine and hope. On the house. First round for the man who's about to lose his shirt to a slot machine in a haunted forest. I want a good seat when it happens. System. Local standing. Hollow stake. Neutral, trending, curious. Jonah looked at the mug, looked at the 2 cores on the bar, looked out the tap room's single warped window, at the black wall of the Blightwood sitting patient, and enormous at the edge of a town that had apparently just adopted him as its resident cautionary tale, and felt, for the first time since a vending machine had ended his first life, something that was almost, not happiness, he wasn't ready to call it that yet, not this early, not with the houses cut, still an open question, but interest. The specific, dangerous, familiar interest of a man looking at a table he intended to sit down at for a very long time. "Pour one for yourself, too," he said, and pulled the 3rd core from his pocket. "I've got a feeling about this next one." He did not, in fact, have a feeling about it. He never had, not once, in either life. That had never once stopped him from saying so, and it did not stop him now. System, result, common tier, prize awarded, minor regeneration, passive. Cuts and bruises heal at 4 times normal rate. The house regrets to inform you this does not apply to embarrassment. Ness laughed so hard she had to sit down. Jonah, staring at the panel, found, against every ounce of professional detachment he'd meant to bring to this new life, that he was laughing too. Chapter 2. Table stakes. Rook. Ashby had been working the Blightwood's edge for 6 years, which in the specific actuarial sense that mattered on a frontier where the average core hunter's career lasted somewhere between 1 season and one very bad afternoon made her either the best in the business or the luckiest corpse that hadn't finished falling down yet. She had her own opinion on which, and it did not involve the word luck. She found Jonah on his 9th day in Hollow Stake, crouched at the Blightwood's tree line with a dead grubbling at his feet and an expression on his face that she recognized immediately, because she'd worn it herself the first season she'd hunted this ground. The specific focused stillness of someone doing math they didn't want to be doing out loud. "You're the one with the gambling blessing," she said, not a question, dropping into a crouch a cautious 10 feet from him with a hunting knife she had not sheathed. "Ness won't stop talking about you. Says you drank her good stock, celebrating a skill that heals bruises faster." "It's a solid skill," Jonah said, without looking up from the grubbling. "Not everything has to be dragon's breath. Some of it's just infrastructure." He glanced up, finally, and did the same quick, involuntary assessment he'd apparently started doing to every living thing he met since day one, an old habit from an old life resurfacing in a new context. What are the odds this goes badly, and what's my out if it does? Whatever the assessment returned on Rook Ashby, 20-something weathered past her years the specific way frontier folk weathered a longbow that had clearly seen more use than care, and an expression that suggested she was doing the exact same math on him. It apparently came back favorable enough that he stood up straight and offered a hand instead of a weapon. Jonah Slate. Rook Ashby. She didn't take the hand immediately, which he respected considerably more than he would have respected instant trust. "You've been at this ground 9 days. You've killed, what, a dozen things. Fed every single core straight into that blessing of yours without holding a single one back to sell for actual coin. Ness is placing bets in the tap room on how many more days before you're either dead or broke. And I want to be real clear that I have money on both, in that order, within the week." "Bold of you to bet against the house," Jonah said, "when you don't actually know what the house pays out." "I know what everyone in this town's watched you pull so far." She ticked them off on her fingers with the specific weary precision of a woman who'd been keeping score. "Potato peeling, coin sorting, a wind noise you refuse to demonstrate, bruise healing. One, I'm told, translates roughly to never getting a splinter, which, actually, that one might be useful, I'll give you that. That's not a blessing, Slate. That's a market stall's worth of party tricks." 5 pulls, Jonah agreed. "Out of a payout table that, best I can tell, goes all the way up to something called Mythic, and 1 tier above even that the house seems very reluctant to actually name." He crouched back down, worked his knife, new, borrowed, badly balanced, he'd need to fix that, under the grubbling's jaw with the specific improved efficiency of someone whose minor regeneration had quietly stopped him flinching from the small cuts this work kept handing out. "I've done this math before, Rook. Different table, different stakes, 1 life ago, and it cost me everything I had, including eventually my actual life. I know exactly what the odds look like from the losing side of a bad night. I'm not walking in blind. I'm walking in with the only skill I've ever actually been good at, which is knowing precisely how bad the math is and sitting down anyway, because the math on not playing is worse." Something in Rook's face shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the specific recognition of someone who'd heard the shape of a true thing even from a stranger. "Explain that," she said. "The math on not playing." Jonah pulled the core free, dropped it into the pouch at his hip alongside the others, and looked out past her shoulder at the black tangle of the Blightwood, close enough now that its wrongness had stopped registering as strange and started registering as simply the view. "Everyone smart on this frontier farms the safe ground," he said. "Coin, haid, meet the ordinary economy, predictable payout, Low variance. You know roughly what you're walking home with before you leave. That's the right call for 99 people out of 100, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But the 100th person, the one who can afford to lose, or the one who's already lost everything once and found out it doesn't actually kill you twice, that person looks at the one patch of ground nobody else will touch, because nobody else can stomach the swings, and does the actual math instead of the comfortable math. He held up the pouch. Every core I feed this machine is a coin flip nobody else on this frontier is willing to take, because they can't afford the downside. I can. I already paid it once, and every single person too cautious to sit at this table is leaving the good pulls on it for whoever is degenerate enough to keep showing up. Rook was quiet for a long moment, turning that over with the specific, unhurried care Jonah was already coming to recognize as her default setting. Nothing about her moved fast except, he suspected, her arrows. I supply cores, she said finally. Been doing it 6 years, selling to the assay post 2 towns over for coin, same as everyone smart. Flat rate, no variance, boring and reliable. Exactly like you said. She nodded at the pouch on his hip. I want in on your table instead, not as a client. As a supplier who takes a cut of whatever comes out the other side instead of a flat price on the way in. That's a worse deal for you on every pull that isn't rare or better, Jonah said, because he had never once in either life let a good mark walk into a bad bet without at least one honest warning, and something about Rook Ashby had already earned that much from him. The math says you should keep taking the flat rate. The math also said a boy who died fighting a vending machine shouldn't have walked out of the Blightwood alive on day 1, Rook said, and there, finally, was something that might, on a face weathered as careful as hers, have qualified as the beginning of a smile. I've been farming this ground alone for 6 years, being the smart, safe, reasonable option nobody remembers the name of once they're back in a proper city telling stories about the frontier. And I'd like for once to be standing next to the interesting math when it pays off or when it doesn't. Either way, I want a seat. System. Local standing. Rook Ashby cautiously allied. Supply chain established. Core acquisition rate significantly increased. Jonah looked at the notification, looked at Rook, and extended the hand again, the one she hadn't taken the first time. She took it now. Their first hunt together taught Jonah 2 things in quick succession that 6 years of solitary work had apparently taught Rook a long time ago, and never quite gotten around to explaining out loud because there'd been no one around to explain them to. The first was that the Blightwood did not treat its edge as a fixed line. Jonah had assumed, the way anyone would assume from looking at a map, that the tree line was the tree line. A boundary you either stood inside of or outside of, danger on one side and relative safety on the other. Rook disabused him of that within the first hour, dragging him sideways along a game trail that ran parallel to the trees rather than into them, reading signs in the undergrowth he couldn't have named if his life depended on it, which, she pointed out without much drama, it currently did. The wood breathes, she said, crouched low, studying a set of tracks pressed into soft ground that looked to Jonah's eye like nothing at all. Some days it's 30 yards further out than the maps say. Some days it pulls back and leaves easy pickings right up to what looks like open field, and that's the days that kill people, because they walk out thinking it's safe ground and it isn't. It's just the wood deciding to let you get comfortable first. She glanced back at him, something assessing in the look. You've been treating your machine the same way, near as I can tell. Assuming the odds sit still because they sat still yesterday. They don't. Nothing out here sits still, Rook said, and moved on before he could ask her to explain further, which he was coming to understand was simply how she taught things. Not through lecture, but by making you watch closely enough to work it out yourself. The same unhurried patience she brought to a bowstring. The second thing he learned was considerably more useful, and came an hour later, when a pack of the same wrong-jawed boarhounds that had nearly killed him on day one broke from the brush in a coordinated rush that made his first encounter look, in hindsight, almost gentle by comparison. Rook put 2 arrows into the lead animal before Jonah had finished registering the danger, called a third command in a low, clipped voice he didn't understand but understood the shape of instantly, "Fall back. Cover the left, and it was only once the pack had scattered, 2 dead and the rest fled back toward the deeper wood, that Jonah realized his own contribution to the fight had consisted entirely of standing very still exactly where she'd told him to stand. "You didn't even draw a blade," Rook said afterward, not quite an accusation, crouched over the larger of the 2 carcasses, working her knife toward the throat stone with the same brisk economy she brought to everything. "You didn't need me to," Jonah said honestly. "You had it handled before I'd even worked out which direction the noise was coming from. That's not a compliment to either of us." She freed the stone, weighed it in her palm, tossed it to him without ceremony. "You're carrying a blessing that might, for all either of us knows yet, be worth more than every arrow I own. That's not a reason to stand behind me being decorative. That's a reason to learn this ground well enough that the next time something breaks cover, you're not waiting on me to tell you which way is left." She said it without heat, the same flat practical tone she used for everything, but Jonah heard, underneath it, something closer to an actual vote of confidence than a complaint. 6 years I've done this alone because nobody else wanted the risk. I didn't sign on to keep doing it alone with an extra body standing nearby watching." "Fair," Jonah said, and meant it, and spent the walk back turning the throat stone over in his fingers with a seriousness he hadn't quite brought to the ones before it, not because this one was worth more, but because Rook Ashby had just, in the space of one blunt sentence, told him exactly what kind of partner she intended to be, and exactly what kind she expected him to become in return. Word travels strangely on a frontier. Not fast exactly. Nothing on the Blightwood's edge moved fast except the things that killed you, but thoroughly, the way water finds every crack in a foundation given enough time. By the end of Jonah's 3rd week in Hollow Stake, with Rook feeding cores into his pouch at a rate that had already outstripped anything he could have scavenged alone, the tap room had acquired a standing crowd on poll nights. Not clients, not partners. Just the specifically frontier breed of onlooker who has nothing better to do at the edge of the known world than watch a stranger risk something interesting. They came, at first, purely for the spectacle. A boy who talked to an invisible machine like it owed him money, who narrated every pull in the exact aggrieved cadence of a man watching a card dealt face down, who had, by Ness's increasingly detailed and increasingly popular retelling, once nearly gotten himself killed by a boarhound and walked away with a passive skill for peeling vegetables. They stayed. Jonah noticed this slowly, the way you notice a tide has turned only once you're already standing in deeper water than you remembered wading into, for reasons that had considerably less to do with entertainment. "You gave old Renner your minor regeneration core draw money," said a broad-shouldered man named Otto Brandt, arms crossed, watching from the taproom's back corner on the night Jonah covered, without being asked, the cost of a healer's visit for a farmhand who'd taken a bad fall on the North Road and had no coin and no assay post connections to speak of. Otto had introduced himself 2 weeks prior as ex-infantry, retired the honest way, meaning I got old before I got dead, and had been since then, a fixture at the back of every pull-night crowd, arms crossed, watching Jonah's reels spin with the specific narrowed attention of a man assessing a recruit. "Didn't have to do that! Didn't have anything better to spend it on," Jonah said, which was true, and also not the whole truth. And Otto's expression suggested he knew the difference. "You built a blessing out of the one patch of ground nobody else would touch," Otto said, "and instead of hoarding what came off it, you're handing it to farmhands with bad luck on the North Road." He uncrossed his arms, finally, in the specific deliberate way of a man reaching a decision he'd been turning over for some time. 22 years I spent watching officers spend soldiers like coin because coin was cheaper to replace than the paperwork explaining why you didn't. You're the first man I've watched on this frontier spending what he's got the other direction. A pause, weighing something. I came to Hollow Stake to watch the human casino lose his shirt, same as half this town. I find I'd rather stick around and see what happens if he doesn't. System, local standing. Otto Brandt, allied. Notice, followers accumulating. Current count, 4. Jonah read the notification twice, the second time with the specific cold water clarity of a man realizing, several steps later than he should have, exactly what shape the last 3 weeks had actually taken. He had come to Hollow Stake, meaning to run a one-man operation, feed cores, pull the lever, survive the Blightwood's edge on the strength of whatever the house happened to hand him. He had not meant to acquire a huntress, a barkeep, who'd started keeping a tally board of pull results on the wall behind her bar like a scoreboard. An ex-soldier watching his back from the corner of every crowd, and he did the count properly now, looking around the tap room at faces that had started arriving specifically to watch him play rather than to gawk at the novelty of it. Considerably more people than 4, who had apparently decided somewhere in the last 3 weeks that this was worth staying for. I didn't ask anyone to follow me, Jonah said, mostly to himself, mostly out loud by accident. No. Rook said from the stool beside him, not looking up from the core she was cleaning with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. You just kept sitting down at the one table nobody else would sit at and being honest out loud about exactly how bad the odds were every single time. And it turns out that's a rarer thing on this frontier than a mythic pull. She set the core down, finally looked at him directly. People don't follow the man who promises them a sure thing, Slate. Everyone out here's heard that pitch and buried the fool who believed it. They follow the man who tells them straight what the odds are and sits down anyway. You've been doing that in front of a full tap room 3 nights a week for 3 weeks. Did you think nobody was going to notice? Jonah looked around the room. Ness's tally board chalk-scratched with every pull he'd made since day 1. Otto's arms uncrossed now, a scatter of faces he was starting, against every instinct from a previous life built on never getting attached to anyone at a table he might have to walk away from, and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with the machine's rigged reels at all. Action system, insert core to play? Yeah, he said, to the panel. To the room, to the 6 years of a woman's caution and 3 weeks of a town's slowly accumulating faith, and fed the next core in. Let's see what the house is feeling generous about tonight. Chapter 3. Double or Nothing. The woman who walked into Hollow Stake's tap room on a rain-soaked evening 6 weeks into Jonah's second life did not look like she belonged within 40 miles of the Blightwood's edge, and she clearly knew it because she'd gone to some trouble not to look like what she actually was. Travel-worn cloak over clothes that had been expensive before 3 weeks on frontier roads had done their work on the hems. Hands too clean for the calluses everyone else in the room wore like a second skin, and a way of scanning the entrance for exits that Jonah recognized instantly because he'd worn that exact expression himself in his old life in exactly one kind of establishment. "You're running from a debt," he said, before she'd even reached the bar, in the same flat diagnostic tone he'd have used identifying a bad shuffle from across a table, not the coin kind. "The kind where they don't take your money back, they take your standing." The woman stopped mid-stride, hand drifting a half-inch toward a blade Jonah suspected she'd never actually drawn on anyone in her life, and looked at him with an expression that shifted over the space of about 2 seconds from alarm through calculation and landed, finally, on something close to relief. "Lady Seraphine Voss," she said, dropping the honorific into the sentence with the specific brittle precision of someone who'd said it 1,000 times at court and exactly 0 times since fleeing whatever she was fleeing. And I would very much appreciate it if you did not say that particular sentence again in a room this full. Jonah Slate, he said, gesturing at the stool beside him with the specific host's courtesy Ness had spent 6 weeks teaching him he apparently owed to anyone who walked in soaked and desperate. And I only said it because I recognize the tell, not because I'm planning to sell it. What kind of debt makes a noble woman run to the one town on the map, too poor and too dangerous for anyone to bother collecting in? Seraphine sat finally and accepted whatever Ness poured her without asking what it was, which told Jonah most of what he needed to know about how bad the last several weeks of her life had been. "Cards," she said. "Dice. A house game 2 provinces east called the Reckoning Table that my family has been quietly bailing me out of since I was 16, till 3 months ago, when they stopped." She turned the mug in slow circles, not drinking, an old and familiar gesture Jonah recognized in his bones because he'd made it himself, at bars very much like this one, in a life he'd died still owing money in. "I am Master Slate. By every reasonable measure, exactly the kind of person you're looking at right now and thinking there's a woman who should never be allowed near a game of chance again." "I wasn't thinking that," Jonah said, honestly. "I was thinking you're the first person I've met in 6 weeks who's going to understand, without me having to explain it twice, why I keep doing this." He nodded at the gold panel only he could see, and gestured, an old showman's flourish he hadn't known he still had in him, at the tally board on the wall behind Ness. 6 weeks of chalked results in a column that ran by now most of the way to the ceiling. "I've got a blessing that eats monster cores and hands back a random skill weighted toward garbage with a payout table that goes, best I can tell, all the way up to something the house won't even name. I have been feeding it every single core I can get my hands on since the day I woke up in this world, in front of a full tap room, 3 nights a week, and I have never once stopped to ask myself whether that makes me exactly the kind of degenerate you just described yourself as." Something in Seraphine's face, carefully composed, aristocratically flat, the kind of expression trained into a person from birth specifically to survive rooms like the one she'd just fled, cracked for just a moment into something raw and unguarded and hungry in a way that had nothing to do with the drink in front of her. "Show me," she said. She told him about the reckoning table before he pulled a single core in the unhurried, compulsively precise way of someone who had never once been allowed to tell the whole story to a person who wasn't already deciding how to punish her for it. It had started, she said, the way these things always started. Small, sanctioned, almost respectable. A private room 2 provinces east, invitation only, run by a family the Voss line had done business with for 3 generations, where the stakes at 16 had been modest enough that her parents considered it an acceptable education in the kind of company she'd one day be expected to keep. She'd won that first year more often than she'd lost, which she now understood with the flat clarity of 6 years' hindsight to be the single worst thing that could have happened to her, because it had taught her exactly the wrong lesson at exactly the age most likely to make it permanent. "They let you win first," she said, turning her mug in slow circles, not drinking. "Every table like that does. It isn't malice, particularly, or it is, but it's patient malice, dressed up as good manners. You don't take a new player's coin the first year. You take their confidence instead, and let the coin follow once they've decided winning is simply what happens to people like them." She looked up at him, and there was nothing performed in the bitterness of it. "By 20, I owed more than my dowry. By 22, I owed more than my dowry and my mother's jewelry combined, and my family had stopped quietly covering it and started quietly discussing whether I was, and I quote a letter I was never meant to read, a liability better resolved through marriage to someone who could absorb the debt as part of the arrangement." A short, humorless laugh. I left 3 days before that particular resolution was set to be finalized. I have been walking roads I've never seen since, staying exactly as long as it takes for word to catch up to me. And I want you to understand, Master Slate, before I sit at your table, that I am telling you this not because I expect sympathy. I am telling you because I need you to know, going in, that I am the single worst possible audience for what you're about to show me, and the single best qualified person on this frontier to actually understand it. I'm not looking for an audience, Jonah said. I'm looking for someone who already knows exactly how badly this can go, and is choosing to sit down anyway with her eyes open. That's a different thing than a mark, Seraphine. I've been a mark. I know the difference in my bones. She held his gaze a long moment, weighing that, and whatever she found in it seemed to settle something she'd been carrying since she walked in soaked from the road. Show me, she said again, quieter this time, and this time it wasn't a demand. It was closer to a request from someone who had spent 6 years being handed only the version of a game designed to ruin her, asking for the first time to see one that wasn't. System result, uncommon tier, prize awarded, reinforced grip, passive. Your hands no longer lose purchase due to blood, sweat, or rain. Ness chalked it up on the board without comment. The crowd had long since stopped groaning at uncommon, which had, over 6 weeks, quietly become the actual floor of what they expected, the junk tier having thinned out considerably as Jonah's pull count climbed, a detail he'd noticed and filed away without yet understanding why. Seraphine, watching from the stool beside him with the specific rapt stillness of a woman witnessing a religious rite, did not look disappointed at all. "Do it again," she said. "That's not—" Jonah started and stopped because he recognized the exact tone in her voice, had used the exact tone in his own mouth 1,000 times in his old life, standing at a machine that had already taken everything he had, and asking, with his whole chest, for one more chance to make it back. "Seraphine, that's the tilt talking. I know the sound of it better than almost anyone alive because I've made that exact sound with my own mouth, and it has never once, in either of my lives, led anywhere good. I have watched this town's tally board for exactly 1 evening," Seraphine said, "and I have already counted 4 uncommon pulls in the last hour alone. Your odds have shifted since your first week, Master Slate. Either the tiers are weighted by something changing on your end, or—" And here her voice did something Jonah recognized instantly, the specific electric focus of a mind that had spent years around games of chance learning to read tells other people missed entirely. "The house pays out better the longer you keep the table open. Pity mechanics. I've seen it in 3 separate gambling halls, dressed up in 3 different names, always the same underlying shape. The longer a mark keeps playing without a big win, the more the house nudges the wheel just enough to keep them at the table. You are not gambling against pure chance, Jonah. You are gambling against an opponent that wants you to keep playing, which means the mathematics are considerably more interesting than a flat random table. And I would bet every remaining coin to my name that nobody in this tap room has actually sat down and worked out the shape of the curve." The tap room went very quiet. Jonah looked at the tally board. 6 weeks of chalk marks he had watched accumulate without ever once counting them properly, too busy living each individual pull to step back and see the pattern, and felt the specific vertiginous drop of a man realizing that the woman who'd walked in, soaked and fleeing a gambling debt an hour ago, had just, without trying especially hard, identified something about his own blessing that he, 3 weeks of a self-appointed statistician's obsessive tallying included, had entirely missed. "You're saying I've been sitting on data for 6 weeks, he said slowly, and never once actually read it. "I'm saying," Seraphine said, and there, finally, unmistakably, was the ghost of the woman she must have been. Before 3 months of running had worn the shine off her, sharp and delighted and entirely too pleased with herself, that you have spent 6 weeks being the most interesting table on this entire frontier, and you have been playing it like a man who's never once bothered to count cards, when the entire skill I have spent my whole disastrous life failing to apply usefully to my own ruin is exactly the skill your table has been missing. System. New party candidate detected. Assess terms? Jonah looked at the notification, looked at Seraphine, and did the thing he'd promised himself on day one, in a ditch with a dead boarhound's throatstone in his shaking hand, that he would do with absolute honesty every single time the stakes were real. I want to be straight with you before you say yes to anything, he said. I'm not offering you a cure for whatever the reckoning table did to you. I don't have one. What I've got is a table that's honest about being rigged, run by someone who's lost everything to a machine exactly like it once already, and is telling you flat out before you sit down that the house does not lose. I can offer you a seat and a cut of what actually comes off it, and my word that I will never once pretend the odds are better than they are. That's the whole pitch. No dressing. Seraphine extended a hand that was, he noticed, considerably steadier than it had been an hour ago. Master Slate, she said, you have just delivered, without meaning to, the single most honest sales pitch I have heard in my entire life, from a gambling hall or otherwise. I accept on the condition that you let me actually chart your pull data properly, starting tonight, because I refuse to sit at a table I haven't at least tried to beat the math on. System, party formation, confirmed. Party member added, Seraphine Voss. New passive unlocked, odds reading. Party members may now view estimated pull probability shifts in real time. Jonah stared at that notification considerably longer than he'd stared at any prize the machine had ever handed him, because it was, for the first time in 6 weeks, not a joke, not a party trick, not a skill for peeling potatoes. It was leverage, real and immediate, against an opponent he'd spent his entire second life assuming was simply unbeatable by design. Well, he said to the room, to the tally board, to the woman beside him, already sketching a probability curve on a bar napkin with the specific manic focus of someone who had just been handed, for the first time in years, a game she might actually be able to win. Looks like the house just made its first mistake. Chapter 4. Split the pot. The woman in gray travel robes who walked into Hollow Steak 3 days after Seraphine's arrival did not scan the room for exits, did not order a drink, and did not, in the 90 seconds it took her to cross the taproom floor to where Jonah sat, once take her eyes off him. You're the one they're calling the human casino, she said, stopping a precise, deliberate distance away. Close enough to speak without raising her voice, far enough to make clear she hadn't decided yet whether she trusted him. Sister Iona Price of the Sanctified Ledger Order, I've walked 11 days to have a conversation with you, Master Slate, and I want to be direct about why, because I find dishonest openings insult everyone's time. I appreciate directness, Jonah said, and meant it, and gestured at the stool across from him with the same host's courtesy he'd extended Seraphine, though something in Sister Iona's flat, assessing stare suggested she was considerably less inclined to accept comfort from him than Seraphine had been. Go ahead, sister. I have spent 9 years counseling men and women whose lives were unmade by exactly the compulsion you have built an entire settlement's economy around, Iona said, sitting, hands folded on the bar's scarred wood with the specific stillness of someone who had rehearsed this speech on the long walk in and intended to deliver every word of it. I have sat with a father who sold his daughter's dowry 3 times over, chasing a win that never came. I have held the hand of a woman who burned down her own shop rather than admit to her husband how much of it she'd already lost to a dice cup. I know the shape of what you're doing here, Master Slate, better than you know it yourself, because I have watched it end every single time without exception, the same way. And you are not simply doing it to yourself. You are doing it in front of a tap room full of onlookers 3 nights a week, with a tally board on the wall like a public shrine to your own compulsion, and you are teaching an entire settlement to worship the exact behavior that has never once in the entire history of my Order's council ended in anything but ruin. The tap room, which had gone very quiet the moment she started speaking, stayed quiet. Jonah felt the specific weight of every set of eyes in the room. Ness's, Rook's, Otto's, Seraphine's, watching from the corner table where she'd taken up permanent residence, with 3 weeks of poll data spread across it like a general's war maps, waiting to see how he'd answer a woman who had just, calmly and without cruelty, called him exactly what he privately suspected he was. "You're not wrong about any of it," Jonah said finally, and watched something flicker across Iona's face. Not triumph, he noted, but something closer to surprise, as though she'd braced for an argument and been handed instead an admission. "I died in my old life fighting a vending machine that owed me $4 I'd already lost to it. I know exactly what it looks like from the inside when the pull matters more than it should, when the next spin feels like it's owed to you specifically, when you'd rather sit at a losing table one more round than walk away and never know what the next reel would have shown. I've lived that. I died of it, more or less, literally. I'm not going to sit here and tell a woman who's counseled the wreckage of that compulsion for 9 years that she's misreading what she's looking at. Because she isn't. Then why?" Iona said, and here, for the first time, something genuinely raw broke through the careful composure of her rehearsed opening. "Do you keep doing it? In front of children, Master Slate, in front of Barkeep, who started keeping score like it's a festival game. I watched 3 boys no older than 12 place bets on your next tier before I'd even finished walking in the door." Jonah was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, it was without the practiced ease he'd brought to every other negotiation of his short second life, because this one, he understood, wasn't actually a negotiation at all. "Because the alternative isn't nobody plays," he said. "The alternative is somebody plays anyway, without the honesty, without the tally board, without a party member." A nod towards Seraphine, who did not look up from her charts but visibly straightened at the mention. "Actively reverse engineering the house's own mechanics so we can eventually stop being the house's mark and start being something closer to its opponent." Somebody was always going to feed cores from the Blightwood's edge into whatever the local equivalent of a rigged machine turned out to be, sister. Because the cores are here. And the desperation that drives people to try is older than either of our religions. I'd rather it be done in the open, with the odds posted on a wall where a 12-year-old can see exactly how bad they actually are, than done in secret by someone with no interest in telling the truth about the payout table. "That is," Iona said very evenly, "the exact justification every gambling hall I have ever shut down has offered me, Master Slate. Better it's us than someone worse. I have heard it from men who ran far crueler tables than yours, and I did not believe them either." "Fair," Jonah said, and did not flinch from it, because flinching, he'd learned in a previous life, was the tell that told a room you had something to hide. "Then judge me on results instead of intentions, sister, because I don't think you've actually asked anyone in this room what's changed here in 6 weeks. He nodded, this time, toward Otto, standing at his usual post in the corner. "Ask him what happened to the farmhand who broke his leg on the North Road with no coin for a healer. Ask Ness what her taproom's takings looked like before I showed up, and what they look like now that this town's got a reason for travelers to stop instead of pass through. Ask Rook what 6 years of farming this ground alone for flat coin looked like compared to 6 weeks of an actual partnership. I'm not asking you to bless the compulsion, sister. I'm asking you to look at what the compulsion has actually built here in the open, where you can check every claim I'm making against the people standing in this room. before you decide whether I'm the wreckage you came here expecting to find." Iona looked around the tap room slowly. At Ness's tally board, at Rook's core pouch resting easy on the bar rather than hoarded, at Otto's straight-backed, unmistakably loyal posture, at Seraphine's charts, at the general unhurried warmth of a room that did not, on close inspection, actually resemble the wreckage she'd walked 11 days braced to find. And her expression, when it finally settled, was not agreement. It was something more useful than agreement. "I am not convinced," she said. "And I want to be clear that I am not here to bless what you're doing simply because it hasn't yet burned down. Compulsions do not announce their damage on a 6-week timeline, Master Slate. They announce it in years." She rose from the stool, robe settling with the specific finality of someone who had made a decision and intended to act on it immediately. "But I have also spent 9 years watching men refuse, categorically, to hear anything I had to say about the shape of their own ruin. You listened. That is rarer than you'd think, and it has purchased you exactly this much of my patience. I am staying in Hollow Stake, not to bless your table, to watch it, and the moment I see this settlement's faith in you curdle into the exact wreckage I've spent my career cleaning up after, I intend to be standing in this room when it happens, telling every single person in it exactly what they're looking at. System, local standing, Sister Iona Price, wary observer. Notice, a party candidate is monitoring current operations. Trust must be earned through demonstrated outcomes." "That's a fair deal," Jonah said, and offered his hand, the same gesture he'd extended Rook, Otto, Seraphine, the gesture that had, in 6 weeks, built him something he was only now beginning to understand he'd never actually meant to build. "I'd rather have someone watching honestly for the wreckage than have nobody watching at all." Iona did not take the hand. But she also did not leave the room, choosing instead the empty stool at the far end of the bar, and Ness, without being asked, poured her a mug of the same aggressively turpentine drink she'd given Jonah on his first night, and something in that small, wordless gesture, a barkeep extending the town's rough hospitality to a woman who'd walked in 11 days to call its centerpiece a slow-motion catastrophe, told Jonah more clearly than any system notification could have that Hollow Stake, whatever else it was becoming, had already decided it was going to weather this argument the way it weathered everything else. Together. Otto found him afterward at the edge of the taproom's porch, looking out at the Blightwoods tree line going black against a sky gone the deep bruise purple of early evening. "She's not wrong," Otto said, without preamble, in the specific gravel-flat tone of a man who'd spent 22 years learning to deliver hard truths without softening them. "About the shape of it. I've watched men chase a win past the point of sense. Watched officers do it with their own soldiers' lives, which is a version of the same sickness dressed up in a uniform." He was quiet a moment, watching the tree line with Jonah. "But I've also watched 22 years of officers who never once, not a single time, stood up in front of the men whose lives they were spending and told them honestly what the odds actually were. You do that. Every pull, out loud, in front of a full room, win or lose." A pause, weighing something the way he weighed every decision, slow and deliberate. "That's not nothing, Slate. That might, in fact, be the entire difference between what she's afraid you're building and what you're actually building. I don't know which one wins out yet, but I've decided I'd rather stand here and find out than walk away before the hand's finished playing." System. Party size 5. Now notice, settlement population trending upward. Hollow Stake is no longer classified as an unincorporated frontier outpost. Jonah read the notification, looked out at the Blightwood, and did not reach for a core to feed the machine that night. The first night he realized with some surprise in 6 weeks that he'd gone to sleep without pulling a single lever. It felt, against every instinct his old life had ever trained into him, like the correct call. The 3 boys Iona had mentioned, no older than 12, by her count, and she'd been generous, they found him 2 mornings later at the edge of Ness's porch, trying and failing to look like they hadn't been waiting for him specifically. "You're the one who does the pulls," the tallest of them said, with the specific bravado of a child who has rehearsed a sentence several times and is delivering it slightly too fast. "We had coin on you getting an epic by the 10th pull. You're on 11 now. We lost." Jonah crouched down to something closer to their eye level, which put an unfamiliar crick in a 19-year-old back that still occasionally surprised him with how little it had in common with the 31-year-old one he remembered. "What did you bet?" The boy's bravado wavered just slightly. "Wasn't much. Bit of string. A good marble." "A good marble is not nothing," Jonah said, with the specific gravity he'd have used discussing an actual wager, because he understood, watching the boy's face, that treating this as a joke would land considerably worse than treating it seriously. "Here's what I want you to understand, and I want you to take it back to whoever else in this town's been laying coin or marbles or anything else on my pulls, because Sister Iona was right to flag it, and I should have said this out loud days ago instead of waiting to be told." He nodded toward the Blightwood's black tree line, visible even from the porch. "Everything I feed that machine, I've already decided I can afford to lose completely, because I died once already not understanding that rule, and I'm not interested in teaching it to anyone the hard way twice. You 3 haven't got a machine. You've got a good marble and a bit of string, and those don't come back around the way a core does. Betting on my table isn't the same thing as sitting at it. I'd rather you spent that string on something you actually get to keep." The boys exchanged a look that suggested this was not the conversation they'd braced for, and the tallest one, recovering some of his nerve, asked the only question that actually mattered to him. "So we can't bet on it at all?" "I didn't say that," Jonah said, and here Iona, who had come out onto the porch without his noticing, listening from the doorway with an expression he couldn't quite read, went very still. "I said, don't bet what you can't afford to lose completely, same rule I hold myself to. If the string's genuinely spare, and the marble's genuinely spare, that's your business, and I'm not going to lecture you for it twice. But I want every one of you to be able to answer one question honestly before you lay anything down again on my table or anybody else's for the rest of your life. If this goes to 0 tonight, does it actually cost you something you needed, or was it only ever spare in the first place? If you can't answer that honestly, you're not old enough to be sitting at any table, mine included, and I'd rather be the man who told you that at 12 than the one who let you find it out the way I did." The boys left considerably more subdued than they'd arrived, and Iona, watching them go, was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. "That's the first time," she said, "I've heard anyone at a table like yours actually tell a child no." "It won't be the last," Jonah said. "You were right to bring it up, sister. I should have said that rule out loud on day 1 instead of waiting for you to walk 11 days to make me say it." Something in Iona's careful composure shifted, fractionally, into what might, given enough time, become something closer to trust. She did not say so. But she also did not go back inside immediately, choosing instead to stand beside him on the porch, watching the same tree line for considerably longer than strictly necessary. Chapter 5. The House Edge. The flood that nearly ended Hollow Stake began, as these things so often did, on ground this close to the Blightwood. Not with the forest itself, but with the thing the forest's presence had quietly been doing to the water table for longer than anyone local had bothered to measure. Rook found the first sign of it 8 days after Sister Iona took up permanent residence at the far end of Ness's bar, a dead run back from the tree line, breathing hard, with news that the seasonal creek separating Hollow's stake from the Blightwood's outer edge had risen 4 feet overnight and was still climbing, fed by something upstream that had nothing to do with rainfall and everything to do with the forest's own accumulating wrongness, finally spilling its banks the way it apparently did according to Ness's grim recollection, roughly once a decade, and had not done since well before most of the settlement's current residents had arrived. "Last time this happened," Ness said, voice flat in the specific way of someone recounting a loss she'd never quite finished grieving. "It took the old mill, both grain stores, and 6 people who tried to save livestock instead of getting clear. Town was a third the size it is now. We don't survive that math a second time with the numbers we've got today." Jonah looked at the notification that had bloomed across his vision the moment Rook finished speaking and felt the specific cold drop of a man realizing the stakes on the table had just changed shape entirely. System, localized catastrophe event detected, Blightwood overflow. Estimated affected population, 34 households. Cumulative fatality risk, high. Time to critical threshold, approximately 40 hours. 40 hours, he said out loud, and Seraphine, already at his elbow with a fresh sheet of the same meticulous charts she'd been keeping for 6 weeks, went very still. "That's not a pull," she said. "That's not a machine result, Jonah. That's the system itself flagging something." "I know." He looked around the tap room, Rook still catching her breath by the door, Otto already moving, unbidden, toward the small cluster of townsfolk who'd followed the news in behind her, Iona rising from her stool at the far end of the bar with an expression that had shifted in the space of a single sentence from wary observer to something considerably more engaged. "I know exactly what this is. This is the first time since I woke up in a ditch on day 1 that the tables stopped being about what I can win and started being about what 34 households stand to lose if I get this wrong." He did not, for the first time in his second life, reach immediately for the machine. "We do this the way Rook's been building the town's defenses for 6 years before I ever showed up," Jonah said instead, and watched something in the room settle. The specific collective exhale of people who had, without quite realizing it, been waiting to see whether the man who'd built this settlement's newfound stability around a gambling blessing would panic the first time the stakes stopped being fun. "Structural work first. Otto, you've got 22 years of logistics experience nobody in this town has thought to use yet. I want a full evacuation route mapped for every household below the old mill line by tonight. Rook, you know this ground better than anyone alive. I need to know exactly where the water's actually going to crest, not where we're guessing it will." "Seraphine, I want every hour of this counted and charted the way you've been charting my pulls, because 40 hours is a number I intend to beat, not simply survive." He turned, last, to Iona, who had crossed the room without his noticing and was standing close enough now that her flat, assessing stare had shifted into something he hadn't yet seen from her. Not approval, not yet, but attention, sharp and undivided. "And, Sistery, I'd take it as a genuine favor if you'd help coordinate whatever this town's temple can offer 34 households in the next 2 days, because I'm not interested this time in doing this alone or doing it for the pull." "You didn't reach for the machine," Iona said quietly, not quite a question. "Not yet," Jonah said. "This isn't a table I get to gamble with other people's lives on before I've done everything the honest way first. If the honest way isn't enough, if we get to our 30 and I'm still short, then yes, I will feed every core in this settlement into that machine and pray to whatever's running the house that the payout table finally does something worth the risk. But I owe this town the actual work before I owe it the bet." Something in Iona's face, watching him say it, cracked. Not into agreement exactly, but into the specific unguarded surprise of a woman who had walked 11 days braced for wreckage and was still, 6 weeks later, finding a table that kept refusing to be the wreckage she'd expected. The next 31 hours were, by unanimous later agreement among everyone in Hollow Stake who lived through them, the least glamorous and most exhausting stretch of Jonah Slate's entire second life, and involved considerably more shoveling than gambling. Otto's evacuation routes moved 11 households clear of the flood line by the end of the first night, using logistics he'd apparently been quietly refining in his head since his very first week watching Jonah's pull night crowds, never once given cause to use them until now. Rook's read of the water table redirected the worst of the coming crest away from the grain stores entirely, funneling it instead down an old drainage cut she'd noted years ago and never had reason to clear. Cleared now in 11 hours of brutal, unglamorous labor by every able hand in the settlement working in relay shifts Seraphine organized with the same obsessive, meticulous precision she'd brought to charting the machine's odds, because it turned out, as she pointed out more than once with the specific dark humor of a woman finding unexpected use for a lifetime of bad habits, that optimizing a shift rotation and optimizing a betting strategy required almost exactly the same skill set. By hour 29, with the creek cresting 4 hours ahead of Seraphine's most conservative estimate, Hollow Stake had moved every household below the mill line to higher ground, reinforced the drainage cut with everything from salvaged timber to— Jonah would remember this detail for a long time, with a specific fondness he hadn't expected to feel about it. 3 of Otto's old infantry entrenching tools, and stood, exhausted and soaked and mostly intact, watching the water finally, grudgingly, begin to recede along the path Rook had chosen for it instead of the path that would have taken the mill. Nobody died. System. Catastrophe. Event. Resolved. Mass prevented total loss. 34 households cumulative risk. High. Resolved to 0 fatalities. Compensation multiplier applied. Substantial. The House acknowledges a rare outcome. The table was beaten without a single pull. Certification. The machine. Tier upgrade available. Jonah read that last line standing ankle-deep in receding mud, soaked through, arms aching from 11 hours of shovel work he'd never have believed his old life's body capable of, surrounded by Rook, Otto, Seraphine, and, standing a careful, still uncertain distance away, but standing there all the same, Sister Iona, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight since a vending machine had fallen on him in a life he barely remembered anymore. "The House acknowledges," he read out loud and laughed, short and disbelieving. "A rare outcome." "What does that mean?" Rook asked. "It means," Jonah said, "that for the first time since I woke up in that ditch, I actually beat the table at its own game, and I didn't do it by pulling a lever." He looked around at the 4 of them, soaked, exhausted, alive, and 34 households behind them who'd stayed that way too, and felt the specific quiet astonishment of a man realizing that the best hand he'd played all season hadn't involved a single card. "I think that might be the first bet I've ever actually won clean." Ness, arriving with dry blankets and the specific weathered relief of a woman who'd watched this exact flood take 6 lives a decade ago and had, this time, watched it take none, pressed a mug into his hands without a word, and this time it wasn't the taproom's aggressive turpentine special. It was something warm and plain and considerably more like gratitude than celebration. That night, once the town had finally gone quiet, once Otto's watch rotation had settled the last of the exhausted volunteers into whatever dry corners could be found, Jonah sat alone at the edge of the receded creek with the gold panel open in front of him, reading the tier upgrade notification for the 4th time with the specific stillness of a man who had just recognized the shape of something considerably larger than a single flood. System. The machine. Tier upgrade available. Cumulative play record extended. Session 4. He read it twice more before the words actually settled. Session 4. Not Session 1. Not the 6-week, 30-some pull record he'd been keeping in his own head since the day he woke up in a ditch with a boarhound's throat stone in his shaking hand. He had counted, carefully, obsessively, every pull he'd ever made in this life. He knew the number, the way a man knows the balance of his own bank account, down to the pull. It did not remotely resemble a number that would justify the word Session 4 unless the machine was counting something considerably older than the 6 weeks he actually remembered living. System. Query logged. Session. History. Prior terms. Response. Access restricted. Sessions 1 through 3 sealed pending claimant resolution. The same flat, bureaucratic non-answer the system had been giving him in one form or another since day one, whenever he'd tried to ask it anything about the actual machinery running underneath his blessing. But it had never before appended anything to that refusal, not once, not in 6 weeks of increasingly pointed questions. And it appended something now, small and gray, formatted less like an official ruling and more like a margin note somebody hadn't quite meant to leave visible. This is not your first pull, contestant. It is your 4th attempt at the table. The House does not disclose the results of prior sessions until the current account has demonstrated sufficient standing to petition for review. Jonah sat with that for a long time, the creak running low and quiet in front of him. The gold panels light the only warmth in the dark beyond the last of the settlement's banked fires. He thought about the dream he still had, twice a year or so, that he'd never once managed to hold on to past waking. A bright, flickering light, a sound like reels spinning, and a feeling, wordless and old, of having stood at exactly this table before and lost something he still, 4 sessions deep by the House's own count, hadn't managed to name. Sufficient standing to petition for review. He thought about 34 households who'd gone to sleep tonight in dry beds instead of drowned ones, about a huntress who'd traded 6 years of safe flat-rate coin for a seat at his table, about an aristocrat charting his odds like a woman finally playing a game she could actually win, about a soldier who'd spent 22 years being spent by other men and had chosen this time to spend himself on purpose, about a nun who had walked 11 days expecting wreckage and was still here, still watching, still, he suspected, though she'd never have said it in so many words, quietly hoping to be wrong about him. 4 sessions, 3 of them sealed. A house that had built its whole payout table, apparently, around watching a man die, chasing a machine, and deciding, evidently, that the correct response was to hand him the machine again and again and again until... what? Until he beat it clean? Until he finally understood what he was actually betting? Was a system. Insert core to play? Jonah looked at the prompt for a long moment, the same prompt he'd have answered without a second thought 6 weeks ago, on day 1, alone in a ditch with nothing left to lose and no one waiting on the outcome but himself. He had a whole town waiting on him now, a whole hand of people who'd sat down at his table on purpose, knowing exactly what the odds were, because he'd told them straight every single time. Not tonight, he said. To the panel, to the dark, to whatever house had been running this exact table on him for 3 sessions he couldn't remember losing. Tonight, I just want to sit here and not owe anybody an outcome for once. The panel, for the first time since he'd woken up in that ditch, did not answer him with a chime, or a notification, or the bright, insincere cheer of a machine that never once, in either life, actually let him walk away clean. It simply, quietly went dark and let him keep the silence. He did not sleep for a long time. Iona found him there some hours before dawn, still sitting at the creek's edge, and did not immediately say anything about the fact that he clearly hadn't moved in a long while. She simply sat, a careful distance away, the same distance she'd kept since the day she walked in accusing him of building a shrine to his own compulsion, and looked out at the same slow, receding water. "Otto told me what the notification said," she said eventually. "Session 4, he thought I should know in case it changed how I ought to be watching you?" "Does it?" "I don't know yet." She was quiet a moment, turning something over. "I have spent 9 years counseling people who couldn't remember the first time the compulsion took hold of them either, not because the system sealed the memory away, but because the mind does that on its own, sometimes, to protect itself from a shame too large to carry forward whole. I don't know if what's sitting behind those 3 sealed sessions is the same kind of wound wearing a stranger's dressing, or something else entirely, something this world's gods built on purpose and are only now getting around to explaining." She looked at him directly, for once, without the flat assessing distance she'd held since arriving. "But I watched you turn down a pull tonight that every instinct in that machine's design was clearly built to make you take. I've never once in 9 years watched anyone do that at the exact moment it would have been easiest to justify it as necessity instead of appetite. Whatever those 3 sealed sessions cost you, Jonah Slate, I don't think this 4th one is going to end the same way they apparently did. You don't know that." "No," Iona agreed. "I don't. I told you from the start I wasn't here to bless the table. I'm here to watch it." She rose, brushing off her robes, and for the first time since her arrival, the gesture she made toward him before she left wasn't distance. It was, unmistakably, if he'd had to put a word to it, something closer to solidarity. "I'll keep watching. But I find, against my own better judgment, that I'm starting to hope I get to keep watching a table that wins clean." She left him there, alone again, but somehow less so, and Jonah sat a while longer with the dark panel closed in front of him. 4 sessions deep into a game he was only now beginning to understand he'd agreed to play long before he'd ever known its name, and found for the first time since a vending machine had ended a life he barely remembered anymore that he was not afraid of the next hand. He was curious about it. That, he decided, watching the first gray edge of dawn find the Blightwoods tree line, was probably the most dangerous thing he'd felt yet, and the first one, in either life, that felt like it might actually be worth trusting,